It is October 17th, 2024, and it's being reported that the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, was just killed in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. As we've seen various images and reports going around, I know that this is something that Netanyahu was doing yet another victory dance over. But we have to remember that 1 year ago, he said that his goal was to defeat Hamas in Gaza. But as I'm sure he knows, although I doubt he would admit it, simply taking out and killing the leader of the group does not defeat the group altogether. In fact, that's what we're seeing with Hezbollah, as you've watched Netanyahu and Israel go after not just Secretary General Syed Hassan Nasrallah, but also the top Hezbollah leadership. Has that stopped the group? No, not whatsoever. And I don't expect it to stop Hamas. But speaking of Hamas, there has been plenty that has been said about both the group and about Sinwar himself, about what they really are doing and what they have done, the accusations against them. But we have to remember, it is no coincidence when you have the Western media parroting claims of 40 beheaded babies or mass rapes or these atrocities that they claim that Hamas carried out targeting Israelis. That's no coincidence whatsoever that those claims don't come from any meaningful sources, from any sort of evidence that we're allowed to see on our end. And yet, as all of this is happening, as you're watching propaganda being spread far and wide by the media here in the US, what's also happening is that you have Israel carrying out the very atrocities it is accusing Hamas of doing. How many children has it killed in Gaza? How many babies? How many Palestinian children, but also Lebanese children? As you are watching Israel expand its campaign of terror across the region. So the question becomes, where will this go from here? Of course, we know that the US is incredibly involved, right? They're not going to be pulling their support anytime soon. In fact, it doesn't even look like they are going to be criticizing Israel in any way. And yes, that includes when Israel detains and targets an American journalist for doing his job. The State Department has apparently nothing to say about that case, even though Grayzone journalist Jeremy Lafredo is now facing years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. He's being widely targeted for doing his job as a journalist, something that other journalists have been doing as well. And yet Israel is specifically singling him out. Now, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Max Blumenthal, a journalist and the editor of the Grayzone. Max, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I'm glad I get to talk to you today. I know that there has been a lot of breaking news going on, even just today, as it's being reported that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar may have been killed in an Israeli strike in Gaza. Now, this also comes as we have reports that Netanyahu has apparently chosen his targets inside Iran for a planned attack that is expected to come before the US presidential election next month. So, how do you view kind of where we stand right now? It almost feels like we're on the edge of a cliff, and Israel and Netanyahu specifically just keep trying to push us over it.
Well, this will be misinterpreted in the West on so many levels. And the man, Yahya Sinwar, will be painted as a savage terror leader who had diabolical objectives. And it's important to understand who he was, where he comes from, and that he had a very clear understanding of the situation he was in and the situation Palestinians were in leading up to October 7th. I've actually been reading the novel that Sinwar smuggled out of prison in 4 parts. He was in Israeli jail for about 25 years, where he taught himself Hebrew, understood Israeli society on a granular level, and negotiated his own release out of prison through the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. And his book tells his life story growing up in the poorest refugee camp in Gaza, the Shati beach camp in northern Gaza, which has been totally destroyed by Israel, and understanding the situation, that there was simply no way out, that there was not going to be any support from larger Arab states unless Palestinians took action into their own hands, and that they would pay a horrific price for anything they did against Israel. I mean, he's recounting brutal massacres and raids going back to Israel's initial occupation of Gaza. He witnessed it all. So the mentality of Sinwar was that, 100,000 people could be killed in Gaza, but this was a liberation struggle like that of Algeria or South Africa or Vietnam. And Hamas had a mass constituency, or has a mass constituency, that upholds a similar mentality, although there are many people in Gaza who do not and appear to regret that October 7th happened. It's really clear now, because of October 7th, what Israel's agenda for the Palestinians in Gaza is and always has been, which was what began the process that began in 1948. Look, they've killed Sinwar, apparently. They killed most of the leadership of Hamas, the pre-October 7th leadership. They've killed Hezbollah's general secretary, Hassan Nasrallah. They've killed IRGC figures in Iran. That's not the point, nor is the point to get the hostages and captives out of Gaza. They could care less about them in the Israeli leadership, particularly Netanyahu. The goal is quote unquote total victory. And what does that mean? It means to finish what began in 1948, to destroy the Palestinian question, to destroy the Palestinians as a nation and end their struggle once and for all, and scatter them into the wind and place the remainders under some kind of Israeli, Emirati, US-backed dictatorship. And that's where the Israelis think things are moving, but they're not, because of the process that Sinwar upended and the acceleration of history that we're witnessing right now. And Israel's now embroiled in battles in southern Lebanon that it's where it's not successful. It's destroying large parts of Beirut, but it's not achieving any clear strategy. And now it's moving towards attacking Iran again. And Netanyahu is choosing his targets as if he's some sort of world dictator who can just move pieces on a chessboard until he completely wipes out his opponent. And that is not, I think even Netanyahu knows that that is not something achievable either. That Iran is a much larger nation with a very confident population. While they don't have they haven't reached the same level of technological advancement as Israel, they have capacity to withstand a heavy assault and to hit back hard, as we saw with their latest strike, which I think surprised a lot of people and clearly targeted military targets. And Hezbollah, they've been underestimated as well. There were these weeks of triumphalism in Israel after the pager attacks and the killing of Nasrallah, but they don't seem to understand how Hezbollah has prepared a very flexible strategy for withstanding powerful blows and hitting back. And we saw them hit back this week with the drone attack on an Israeli base, a Golani base of one of the special forces divisions in Binyamina, actually south of Haifa, somewhere Hezbollah hadn't even hit yet. Israel's economy is not doing very well. Its population in central Israel is now constantly hearing air raid sirens and having to shelter, something they haven't really experienced. So where is this all going for Israel? It's unclear. They're moving kind of into the abyss. Whereas for Sinwar, who started this whole process, which really, as I said, is like an acceleration of history, for him, it was clear where this would go. He knew it would end with his death. He knew that his martyrdom would actually fortify the ranks of Hamas's grassroots, just as Nasrallah's has done within Lebanon, and that the resistance would continue with a terrible price paid by the civilian population, because that's what he'd witnessed for his entire life. And we haven't addressed the Americans here yet. But for Israel, yeah, they've scored some tactical victories, but there's no strategy there. For the resistance axis, the strategy appears to be very clear, and their score, and while they lose a lot of battles, they may not lose this war.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring up the strategy because so often I look at Israel and I'm going, okay, what is their actual strategy here? I mean, yeah, exactly as you were saying, they may say, oh, hey, we got Nasrallah, or in this case, we got Sinwar. And I do want to get into where the Americans stand in all of this. But first, I wanted to touch on one point that you made when talking about kind of the understanding of Sinwar and the understanding of Hamas as a resistance group, because I know that you recently came out with a documentary titled Atrocity Inc. How Israel Sells the Destruction of Gaza. And I would encourage everyone to go check it out. I'll leave the link in the description below. But what I thought was so interesting about watching this was that you really highlighted how many different lies have been told by Israel about Hamas and the Palestinians just in the last year, but also how the mainstream media in the West has been essential in carrying those lies, whether it's the 40 beheaded babies or the mass rapes by Hamas. The goal seems to be to turn this resistance group into the new ISIS. Now, given the research that you've done, how has the propaganda and the US media's embrace of it been instrumental in selling Israel's genocide over the last year?
Yeah, Atrocity Incorporated is the culmination of all the work I've done since October 7th and the work of my colleagues in independent media to debunk Israel's atrocity porn and the various hoaxes that they've spun out to shock the Western public into supporting Israel's genocidal policy in Gaza and its expansionist policy, which is now reaching deep into Lebanon with horrific violence. I mean, we're now seeing entire villages wiped off the map. And what this documentary, which is mainly a monologue by me, supplemented by lots of media footage that a lot of people will recognize, what it really shows and exposes is the collusion of US corporate media with the apartheid regime of Israel in selling this genocide. And there are some characters who bear particular blame. Jake Tapper at CNN, Dana Bash at CNN, Wolf Blitzer. CNN bears particular blame, as well as fake rescue organizations like Zaka in Israel, which have raised millions of dollars, spinning out hoax atrocities, which were then not only broadcast by CNN, but repeated by Secretary of State Tony Blinken and President Joe Biden in order to justify blocking a ceasefire and bear hugging Netanyahu. You also have the hoax of mass sexual violence on October 7th, which Israel started to push when the other fabrications started to fall apart and get retracted. And I take aim at those, and particularly the New York Times article Screams Before Silence, which was supposed to represent the capstone on this propaganda construct, but which quickly fell apart once we in independent media started picking apart the sources and showing how testimony did not match up with forensic and physical evidence from October 7th. We also go after Sheryl Sandberg's documentary, Screams Before Silence, weird title, and show how she not only reproduced a lot of these hoaxes, but also violated the Geneva Conventions by featuring testimony by Palestinian prisoners, which was clearly false confessions, which had been coerced through torture. So Sheryl Sandberg has made herself complicit, not just in Israel's genocidal propaganda, but in actual torture of defenseless Palestinian males who we know now are being sodomized in torture centers like Sde Timan, according to Israeli policy.
Yeah, and it's really concerning, exactly as you're laying it out there, the crimes that have actually been committed by Israel, how often they try to spin this off and to say, oh, this is something Hamas is doing, or this is Hamas killing babies. When I mean, how many babies has Israel killed over the last year? Thousands at this point of children, young children that they've targeted and killed knowingly so. And the US has stood by and allowed all of it. I mean, it's no secret that Biden is pro-Israel, that he describes himself as a Zionist, but I mean, what the Biden administration has done, even from just the early days of saying, "Oh, well, we don't want a ceasefire, we just want a humanitarian pause," to now with their latest actions of condoning every single war crime that Israel has carried out, to the point where we're looking at a possible conflict with Iran if this keeps escalating. How do you see the position that the US is playing right now?
Well, the U.S. is now playing. The U.S. is playing the same role that is always played through the National Security Council led by Jake Sullivan, the negotiator who is supposed to be negotiating a ceasefire in Lebanon, Amos Hochstein, who also happens to be a former Israeli army soldier who piloted a tank at one point. They keep erasing that from his Wikipedia page. And Tony Blinken and Brett McGurk, who is also a White House official who's very close to the Saudis and the Emiratis. These are some of the worst foreign policy personnel that have ever been in a hall of power in my lifetime. And they are responsible they've presided over a Holocaust, but what they've done at the same time is bought Israel time and diplomatic goodwill by constantly claiming that they were working to negotiate for a ceasefire. And now that hoax has been exposed as well. They never really wanted a ceasefire. Obviously, if they had, they would have followed US law, identified correctly months ago that Israel was blocking US humanitarian aid to Gaza, and then in following US law, suspended arms shipments to Israel, which is mandated, not just under the Leahy Act, but under various arms control regulations. And Blinken has explicitly violated US law by continuing to sell and ship weapons to Israel, knowing that it's blocking aid. Now, finally, Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, who owns tons of stock and has tons of stock in Raytheon because he sat on the board where he made millions of dollars. Blinken and Austin have finally issued a letter to Israeli Defense Secretary Yoav Gallant, accusing Israel of blocking U.S. humanitarian aid and warning that in 30 days, they could cut off arms to Israel unless it let the aid in. What happens in 30 days? Well, that's a few days after the U.S. election. So they obviously waited for this point because they were afraid of Israel's lobby and the Zionist billionaire class, which is underwriting the Kamala Harris campaign and which also underwrote the Biden campaign and which literally paid for the entire construction of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Arlington, Virginia.
Wow.
The top Democratic donor, Haim Saban, who is an Israeli, who said that I'm a one-issue guy and my issue is Israel, paid for the entire construction, $7 million of the DNC headquarters in Arlington. So they are afraid of Israel's cutouts in the US. That's why they've applied no pressure and allowed this Holocaust to happen. And now we're getting clear images. When I say Holocaust, what is a Holocaust? It's a giant fire, a conflagration that consumes all life. And we're seeing images of young men like Shaban al-Dahlu, a young man who wanted to just work in a tech startup, who'd been dodging death for over a year, burned alive in a medical tent outside the Al-Aqsa hospital in Deir al-Bala with an IV in his arm. These images really crystallize what the Biden administration has done in Gaza. And they expect people who care about the world and humanity, who have a conscience, who are young progressives in the US, to go out and vote for them. They don't think this is going to be a red line. And they're about to pay a heavy price at the polls for not only supporting this criminal regime in Israel, but for taking their own base for granted and thinking that, we're just going to go, vote for abortion while babies are suffering post-birth abortions at the hands of Israel's genocidal drone jockey army.
Yeah, it really is incredibly concerning to watch the way, exactly as you said there, the Democratic Party seems to have just written off a significant portion of their base, acting like, they'll get over it. They won't worry about Gaza. Because why? Because Donald Trump, right? Because you think that Donald Trump is somehow going to come in and, I guess, end the world, or at least end the country at this point, although he's not much better on Israel. But while I have you on, I do want to ask you about a case that I know hits close to home for you. Speaking of Israel's many crimes, because a journalist for the Grayzone, Jeremy Lafredo, was detained by Israel last week under claims that he was somehow supporting an enemy during wartime with his reporting. His passport was seized and he's being kept inside Israel. The U.S. apparently couldn't be bothered to speak out about its own citizen or to do anything for him. Will you take us through the latest there and where his case stands?
Well, Israel's killed over 120 journalists in Gaza, targeting them at home. It blew the head off of Al Jazeera's correspondent Ismail Al Ghul, just paralyzed one of his cameramen who's now in a coma. So we've seen how Israel has total contempt for the journalists who are bringing the world to the front lines of the Gaza Holocaust. But now it's escalated, and it's taken a U.S. citizen into custody. It arrested him at a checkpoint in the West Bank. Jeremy Lafredo, along with several colleagues, brutalized them, roughed them up, treated them with total contempt. And then it let everyone go except Jeremy because of a video that he produced for us, or published with us at the Grayzone, where he was just following a major news event. Because when he arrived on this trip in Israel, Iran had just retaliated and struck Israel with ballistic missiles, over 200 ballistic missiles, most of which made impact. And so, Jeremy and I were talking, and I said, this is a major news story. And he said, yeah, I'll go see where the missiles hit. That should have been what every journalist was doing. And in fact, many journalists had done it before him. So he went and documented a crater that had already been filled in outside the Mossad headquarters in North Tel Aviv. And he showed where a ballistic missile fell outside the Nevatim air base in southern Israel. But he wasn't in the air base. He wasn't anywhere near there. The missile was just sitting there on a road. And Israel is now accusing him of supporting an enemy in a time of war, and implying that he's not a real journalist, and even trying to suggest he's some kind of spy or something, which is absurd and extremely dangerous, because this is a serious crime he's being investigated for. And the Israeli police, despite two judges ruling that Jeremy did not violate military censorship policy, continues to investigate him. It's October 17th right now, and they have till October 20th to complete their investigation. I don't know what's going to happen, but they should just let him go home. That's what he wants to do. He doesn't have they've seized his phone. They're combing through his phone. They broke into his phone. They have his passport, so he can't leave. And they have his wallet, so he's had no access to his own finances. And we're finally starting to get some support, not just from press freedom NGOs like the Courage Foundation, Freedom of the Press Foundation, Committee to Protect Journalists, but also Jeremy's assembly member in New York, who represents him in Manhattan, has issued a statement declaring that Jeremy was conducting normal journalistic work as any journalist should, and he should be immediately allowed to go home. That's Assembly Member Harvey Epstein. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a fervent pro-Israel partisan, also issued a statement calling for Jeremy's release, because Jeremy used to work for RFK at Children's Health Defense as a journalist. And so, I really commend RFK for looking past politics here, and also highlighting the fact that Jeremy is a very credible professional journalist who is doing what every other journalist should have been doing. Now, there's one other point I want to make, which is that if you just Google satellite images, Iranian missile strikes, Israel, you will find that every mainstream publication has published detailed satellite images showing where Iran's missiles hit, including Israeli media. This is much more detail than Jeremy offered. So why are they accusing him of this and claiming that, oh, his work might allow the enemy to recalibrate its strikes? It looks like a political persecution, and we haven't heard anything from the State Department of substance. It's time for them to compel his release from a country that wouldn't last for a second without US diplomatic and military support.
Yeah, for the US to allow this, and I think the silence that we're hearing from the Biden administration really speaks volumes about what they are allowing to happen on their end. Certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest. Max Blumenthal, a journalist and editor of the Grayzone, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for the work you're doing.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you can also find weekly episodes of my new series called Sanctioned, which is exclusive for paid subscribers. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can also participate in regular polls and Q&As and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.